Okay, thank you all for the debate. Welcome back. I have the results of the debate as it happened. I'm going to give you the positions. I'm going to give you the feedback, the key feedback, if you would like to have more personal feedback, or if you have any questions about whatever, do come up to me. So the positions goes as follows. I gave the first to opening opposition, the second to closing opposition, the third to opening government, and the fourth, unfortunately, one to you. I think that you were a bit confused about what the motion was at times. I think that opening government provided us with a good enough reason, or with a good enough explanation of what they thought refugees were versus migrants, especially economic migrants. So I don't think you've proven to me on a principle level why we should allow for this policy to happen in the world, especially when we have opposition that come up and that say you're going to create all of these problems, and there are also burdens from local governments or more local governments, country governments, or even the EU government towards their own citizens, right? When you talk about lives, when you talk about quality of lives, I didn't really see how the principle you were proposing, when I would weigh those two up, was much better, but also would, in the end, provide more security of lives, or even a better standard of life. So I think that those are the problems the proposition had to deal with. I don't think you've dealt with it sufficiently. But other than that, I thought interesting issues were risen. I think that the visa points of the government, of the first government, when you talked about the people don't have to organize paperwork. First of all, they do have to organize paperwork, it's just not visa. But secondly, there isn't really an infrastructure to organize anything locally. We're given the balance. So I think that there's definitely paperwork involved, just not in the war area or in the disaster area themselves. So to me, it was a bit unclear what you were trying to prove there. Also, the point about the business, I think, was brought up by the second speaker. I don't really see how they're going to go back to their business or how it's going to be an incentive for them, because usually if you talk about a disaster area that makes them refugees according to your own definition, business is not going to stay there itself, it's not going to be profitable. Usually it dies. If you look at Ukraine, most companies have lost their business, a lot of companies have gone out of business. So to that extent, if you're talking about a chaotic area, business is not going to survive by itself in there. There has to be some kind of trade, there has to be some kind of movements. And for these people to go back, to have that as an incentive, for me it seemed a bit weird, or a bit of a weird idea. Okay. Moving on to opposition now. Opening opposition, I thought you had an interesting case. I think you had a lot of arguments, also well analyzed. The duty argument, which clashed directly with the burden, what kind of burden or duty that we have towards the whole community. I think you explained well, or you kind of made the distinction that every government basically has, first of all, the right towards its own community or local community. It depends how you see the local community, whether it's a country, whether it's the EU or an area. But I don't, for me, even from a philosophical point of view, I don't see how every life is necessarily equal. I believe that there is always a difference, even with family relations, different relations that you have, mother-daughter, and so on and so on. And that kind of translates towards your neighbors, that kind of translates towards people who you associate yourself with. So I think that the clash of these immigrants being from another culture, I think it could have be done a bit differently, because I don't think they're necessarily don't know the culture. It's not the problem that they don't know the culture or they don't know the language. I think that it's the association you have with those people and the kind of duty you feel towards those people as well, right? So it doesn't necessarily need to have a negative connotation. The connotation that it has is that although you might want to help them, obviously you don't have
endless resources to help everybody. So these resources need to be located towards the people that you feel, well, most related to or most duty towards, and there is always a kind of level in there. So be careful with that framing. But I think you dealt with the lack of the community point and the social backlash that arises in Germany, especially nowadays. This flooded with immigrants. So I think everybody knew what the motion was about. Everybody knew the setting of the motion, which was nice. I feel that the second speaker didn't really elaborate a lot on the arguments from the first speaker. That's for the opposition. So I think that you guys had more or less the same case, but I felt that there was a repetition within the second speech, and there could have been more, maybe different lights or maybe a different kind of rebuttal that you could have done there. So be careful with that in the next round. Okay, second half. I feel that the second half had an interesting. You had an interesting perspective on how it would be positive if immigrants would come, for example, to develop country because they provide a cheaper labor force. I think it's true to some extent, but the problem is that, especially with refugees, and it was pre-rebutted by the first speaker, you don't know who these people are, right? So when you have a controlled refugees or controlled migration, that's what happened in the 90s. You can control what kind of people you let in with different kinds of skills. They don't necessarily need to be high skills, right? They don't necessarily need to be all engineers. That's what America was going for in the 90s. Germany and Holland, for example, were going for low skilled workers, right? So they saw that the local population didn't want to or didn't have to go to work in the factories, but they wanted to keep the production within Europe at that time. So they invited guest workers from Morocco and Turkey. Most of them stayed for now. They're third generation living there. A lot of them are on social security. So it doesn't necessarily need to be that they don't provide a big economic boost. Yes, they do. But the problem with uncontrolled uncontrolled migration or uncontrolled border regulations is that you don't know who you're letting in, and because you don't really have the necessary paperwork before these people arrive, you don't really know what to do with them or how to put them into the skill sets that they can provide. So it creates a bit of chaos, and that chaos is a thing that can't really be that can't really be controlled, basically. So I think it's a good point, but you failed to show me how you're going to implement it and how it would work out. Show me what skills are needed, for example, what are we lacking exactly if you're talking about Germany. Switzerland is not going to let anybody in because they have the same policy that I'm talking about. They let migrants in, for example, in the airport. If you come in, everybody there is an immigrant, people who work in kitchens, people who work in even in security. But they have very strict quotas on how they test you before you're allowed to come and work there, and you can never become a citizen, really. So they can control when you come and leave as well. And that's something that with refugees is also a point of discussion, because if they stay there for 10 years and after the war is gone, you want them to go back. If they have children, for example, it's very hard to tell a child that you're not a citizen of this country, but they have never lived anywhere else, they don't know the language anymore. So with uncontrolled policies like this, there are a lot of problems that can arise, especially long term, and you have to combat those in your principle. You have to show how the mechanisms are going to work, how you're going to streamline the problem within, especially when you talk about Western country, right, where people are probably not going to want to leave. This is also one of the points that was brought up by the second opposition, when they said, how are you going to make sure that these people that these people are going to move back to the country? You don't know whether they're patriots, right? But everybody's a patriot. So I think that's a very hard claim to make. For me, an interesting point was from the extension speaker as well, when you said that, well, you don't really have a freedom of movement anymore within your own, for your own citizens, right? So, although Europe officially used to be, I think last year, a zone where you could have a freedom of movement, still there are always some restrictions on that. So I think it's nice when you take practical cases and you explain them with mechanisms, and it shows more or less from a principle point of view onto a practical point of view how in practice some things don't really work out based on principles that you would like to propose. Yeah, the problem and a solution thing was raised by the summary speaker. Yeah, I think the problem nowadays that you've addressed the problem. I think the debate was very focused on the problem that we have, the Syrian refugees or even the Islamic State refugees, right, who flee to Europe. You could have said, for example, that it's not only a cultural thing; it's also a question of the religion, because most of these people who come in, they're Muslim, and already in Europe there's a big backlash towards Muslims. Not necessarily grounded, but it's how the politicians frame it, and it's how the extreme right-wing right-wing movements where they gain their power from, because they create this division within the society based on these inequalities, also based on the fact that people don't talk to each other anymore. If somebody goes to, if somebody's Muslim and they stay within the Muslim community, they might be neighbors, but there is a low chance that they will ever speak to each other and really know who these people are. So they very much handle and they very much base their decisions and their framing on some kind of stereotypes that they get from the media, etc., etc. So I think that for me, at least, I thought the debate was detailed enough, but don't focus too much on just Syria and Germany. Also try to broaden, for example, you could have also talked about the Donbass refugees, right? Because even within your own countries, you can have refugees, and you can see how people react towards a refugee stigma, even if you're a citizen, right? So these are people with papers usually, or a passport, Ukrainian passport, but still there is a backlash created. And if you analyze this backlash, if you show me how these things work within the society, how these people are viewed, I think you will have enough material to feel pretty much the same debate. So you don't have to be restricted on it, what you see on the media, as to speak. So yeah, that's my feedback or analysis so far. Do come up to me if you want individual feedback. Other than that, good luck in the third round.